Welcome to Culture Crush with me, your host, Dan Dowman, where we get to meet some of the world's leading culture shapers, future makers, and power shakers. Today's episode is brought to you by Anthem. And as always, we'll be talking groundbreaking cultures, leadership challenges, and what you can do about them. Today, I'm joined by culture shaper Paula Brockwell. Paula, it's so great to have you on the show.
Thank you. I'm excited to have a chat with you.
This is a nice moment for us because we've been, getting to know each other over the last few months, and we have attempted to record our podcast once before, but technology was not our friend that day. So I'm glad we're finally able to make this happen and to continue enjoying a blossoming friendship around culture, psychology, leadership, and all of those wonderful subjects. Now, you're a bit of an expert in this field. You are a trained psychologist. Your business, the Employee Experience Project, has been going for over 6 years now, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
So why don't you tell us the Paula Brockwell story in as long as you want?
Gosh, how long have you got now? I'll not go that far, I promise. Not when I was a child. I formed the Employee Experience Project about 6 years ago. Off the back, if I'm honest, of the nearly 20 years, I don't like saying that, but the nearly 20 years experience of working in culture change consultancy through various lenses, from supporting with things like assessment and selection with big government departments as they were going through a lot of change, to working within wellbeing to try and maximise performance by supporting people to have good days at work. But I think as I built out my own business, I really leaned into the lack of energy that had driven me out of my previous role, really getting to a point of burnout, and realising, I think, that a lot of the culture industry is based on trying to do the best that it can in the limitations of the system. So accepting that we won't always get leaders' attention, accepting that culture and engagement sits with HR, and trying to do things around the edges, etc. And I just decided that as I built the business, that I wasn't going to play in that world anymore. I was going to create a methodology that, instead of being frustrated about those challenges, looked to overcome them. So that's what's brought me here, really, is 6 years of passion, curiosity, and playing with techniques from areas, within behavioural science, but also looking to marketing, things like nudge theory, mass behaviour change, etc., looking at health promotion, to build a methodology that's more about how do we get everybody involved in owning culture and understanding that it's just about ways of working. So that's what I get to do. I love it. I live my passion, do what I really enjoy, and only really work with businesses that are either really ready to do it differently and get everybody involved, or where I see the route to us being able to get people excited about doing that.
I'm so glad you've mentioned the sort of way culture gets locked into HR, into kind of like private cliques within business. So that's my language. I know that you didn't say it quite like that.
Agreed.
But we're going to come back to that question in a moment. But there's two things that I'm interested, right? There's a question about you being a founder and an entrepreneur, and how you knew that it was the right time to set up your own business. Like, what gave you the confidence that your career experience so far could translate into your own endeavor? And I'm also curious about whether that you stopped one thing and then started your own business, or was there a transition period where you were experimenting with, perhaps you were doing both at the same time? Second to that, who are the people that you really want to serve with your resource and training? Like, who are the people that you're trying to reach? Not necessarily thinking about organizations you want to work with, but who in those organizations are you trying to speak to?
Absolutely. Makes sense. So why did I decide to jump? Honestly, I was reaching burnout. I had a lot of stuff going on in my own personal life that I needed some space on. I just wasn't enjoying working within the wellbeing space, because I felt like I was badging people up and sending them out into war. So I think the jump was more about self-preservation, but a confidence that I had while I'd worked for big businesses and big brands in the past. it was still me driving the impact. And I think that realization is one that I notice in a lot of people as they take the transition into kind of running their own businesses. Is often they're really anxious that it was the brand that made them do things or the infrastructure, but you're still a person within that making that happen. So I just got to the point where I wasn't enjoying what I was doing anymore. And I'm a big, I'm a big believer in being the change you seek. So I just thought I'll remove myself from that environment and see what happens. And I did a lot of associate work to kind of keep myself financially secure as I figured out really what I wanted the employee experience project to do, and worked with some really friendly and known clients to experiment with the methodology. So, I think there is a sense of bravery. You've got to back yourself, but also recognize what your unique value is, even within the environments that you're operating within. That would be my advice. And in terms of who do I serve? Well, two groups really. My ultimate responsibility, honestly, is to the people and their day-to-day experience, who the masses really who work within organizations. I'm not to take you back to my origin story, but I'm the daughter of a Northern Irish prison officer in the 80s who worked in the biggest political prison. So I've got this really strong lived experience connection of seeing what good and bad work do for people. And, my dad did a really great job of keeping that stuff at the edges. He didn't get the chronic alcoholism and kind of terrifying life experiences that a lot of his friends got that killed them when they were in their 50s and 60s. But you could see the echoes of his job and the environment that he operated in how he functioned day-to-day life. So the thing that brought me into culture change, first of all, was about trying to make a difference and make as much good work for as many people as possible, because it fuels good lives and it fuels good communities. But I think from my professional experience, so many of my clients within HR just felt so isolated and overwhelmed by the time I was working with them, because they had this thing called culture sitting on their shoulders and everybody was looking to them to influence it, but not looking to be part of that change. That really I set the business up to build capability and break down some of the really challenging narratives that I think there are around good culture change that are forcing HR people into really unsustainable positions, feeling like they've got to own it and drive it themselves and superhero it through, and it just doesn't work. So that's a long answer, sorry, but it's about those two pieces for me: making great work, but also there's a revolution, I think, that we need to have within the HR community that's about supporting them to understand that they're not the gatekeepers of culture, they're the architects, and that they can really enable the rest of the business to own that and drive that in really fantastic ways.
I think we're talking here about liberation,
Mm.
liberation of people who are, as you say, being crushed under this weight of expectation around culture in the world of HR, in people leadership, um, chief people officers, all of those kind of job
Yeah.
titles. And the reason why I use the word liberation, a word as strong as liberation, it's because where culture fails to work coherently, right? When I talk about culture, I talk about intentions, actions, and outcomes. Those three
Mm.
pieces of the puzzle working in harmony together. And when, for example, intentions, like things like values, purpose, who we say we want to be, when those things aren't backed up in actions, what you have then isn't culture, it's propaganda. Because what an organization says about itself simply isn't true. It isn't, as you say, people's lived experience. And I think the biggest problem for people who are working in HR is that oftentimes they're the kind of last line of defense for the company. Often they're not the first line of defense for the people. As somebody who's experienced a number of redundancies in my career, it's really difficult for you to be the champion of inclusion, diversity, and culture, and also be the kind of the person who swings the scythe when big decisions have to be made. Like, how can the same person be responsible for doing both things? So I think there's an immense pressure on these roles within business, and you're absolutely right. I think we need to find a pathway for them to be able to lead those conversations, but also be liberated from the pressure of it. I think the business context in which they work needs to recognize that we need to empower and enable these people to work in a different way. So intentions can connect into actions. Because if we don't give them that kind of power to lead, to involve, to include, then what we're going to end up with is propaganda, not culture. And that's when employees start to become very disengaged. Like, I know that I've probably said a whole bunch of thoughtful and triggering things there, but what are your thoughts on that?
I would agree. I think, in my experience, I think people leaders are caught in this really hard place because a lot of them are attracted into the profession because they want to make a difference to people. They are empaths. They are people pleasers often, and so they get caught in this role where they are the custodian of the employee experience. They might be the only people in the room who are having those difficult conversations with exec about how that decision they've made or that action that they're taking really is influencing people on a day-by-day basis. But then similarly, they're trying to uphold performance and manage fish in the microwave or whatever the ridiculousness is. So they end up being these people who are caught policing two very different lenses. One is are
Yeah.
the masses being doing what the business needs, and then one is trying to get leadership to do what colleagues need. And for me, the biggest issue that I see in a lot of cultures, and I think a really big challenge that we've got around the world of work at the moment, is that most people have forgotten that they're in service to the organization. So leaders
Mm.
think that their role is to test and check and be made to feel safe by their colleagues. So it's all about things coming up, owning decisions that they think only they can make, but also making sure that everybody's doing what they need to do. And they forget actually that their job's really about enabling those tens of hundreds of extra feet and hands on the ground to do a great job, because that's what will drive business success. And similarly, I think a lot of colleagues, particularly post-pandemic, believe that businesses are there to make them feel happy, safe and satisfied with no kind of reciprocal deal in terms of what you need to deliver in terms of value. There's the psychological contracts are out. So a lot of what we do is about stopping, talking to HR about what's your role in this. It's not to keep trying to police these people with the wrong deal, but step back, be a coach, be a guide, be a kind of conductor of the orchestra that is your organization to help those people enact the right roles. And that's where I see one of the biggest challenges is it, particularly with value use. We create this aspirational concept of where we all want to go to. And then we say to HR or people leaders, get us there. Well, I don't need to change, but if you could get us there, that'd be brilliant. And I think if we can support HR, comms teams, etc., to recognise that their job is about helping people see their role and play their role in creating ways of working that work for the individuals and for the business, that's a game changer. It's that piece around role definition and acceptance of responsibility is huge.
I think we're hitting on some really, really interesting themes here that we could dive in on one of these subjects probably for the whole of our time together.
All
But
day.
one of the
Yeah.
things, yeah, well, you'll have to come back for another episode. Um, one of the things that you mentioned there is that when people entering HR are often like empathetic, empath people, right? And I think what's really strange when we think about it, like just when we shine a light on this, it's so weird that we expect these people to be facilitators, coaches, guides, in a sense, embody the role like a maternal role in a way, and a sort of the role of a teacher or an educator, like somebody who is shepherding staff through a business,
Mm.
right? And then we also expect them to act like the police, that when there's a restructure or when tough decisions need to be made, it's the same people who then have to deliver the bad news, or like you say, sorting out who's put smelly fish in the microwave, or like they become these kind of policing characters, which I think is such a strange role for to ask people to fulfill. Like there really does need to be this distinction between organizational operations and tough decisions and the role of coaches, mentors, educators, enablers in the business. Because where else in life do you find the same person fulfilling both characteristics? So I think that's just a
Yeah.
really interesting contrast that we've been sort of unpacking. And I think there's a kind of a micro example of how this happens as well. And you've mentioned this before about employee wellbeing programs. When businesses, roll out small benefits to their employees, like a workplace yoga class, or like, hire somebody for the day to do like a lunchtime meditation or something like that. And these are really nice things to do. Like, I'm certainly not knocking them, but I also think it's kind of strange that if you don't have a secure, stable, proactive, positive, inclusive, ownership-led culture in place already, when you do those kind of things, you're all you're doing is reminding people of how shit it is. So you take them out into like a
Yeah.
meditative space or like a well-being program, right? And they spend an hour thinking about life, what it all means. And then they finish that hour and they go back to the same crappy work. They've sort of reminded them about how toxic everything is, right? Like, that for me is such another strange contrast in business when we're sort of tinkering with well-being rather than really thinking about it at depth.
For me, it's that analogy of just bandaging people up and sending them back out into war. Use that time, use that energy to look at your resourcing model, look at your priority setting within your strategic plan. Fundamentally, there will be things about the way that you're doing business that are coming together to create the experience that your colleagues are having. And whether that influences their energy and well-being in terms of an ability to do a good job, or their engagement or their clarity around what's expected in terms of standards and expectations. Prime for me, if you prime the environment for people to succeed, their natural human instinct to want to feel good about themselves, to want to feel competent and capable, wins over. So if you're getting destructive or unhelpful behavior from your staff, you have primed your environment to receive that, would be my suggestion. So for me, it's all about creating the infrastructure, the ecosystem that allows people to do a great job. And HR have a huge role in that, but their role is about building the capability to bring the best out of people. And I use the example a lot of, you don't see IT outgoing, I've given you your laptop and I've given you your keyboard. Now, sorry, so you want to put Paula into the keyboard, but let me just type Paula for you. There you go, it's done. HR needs to start to find that distance in terms of saying, look, our job is to give you the tools, the resources, the opportunities and structures that you need to do this well, but it's not our job to type on the keyboard. We've given you that now, so do that. If you don't know how to do it, we'll give you some training, but it's not our job to type it in. And I think that's the difference I see a lot, is that desire to help and need over time, we fill the space because nobody else has, and then we feel really frustrated that nobody's acting, but we've superheroed ourselves into that place really as a profession. And I don't think that the professional bodies, the big providers, etc., help at all. They are playing in that narrative of letting leadership set at a distance and not hosting a different conversation around it. But that's probably a Friday night with a glass of wine conversation, because I get quite grumpy about that once I get going.
But we're knocking on the door of something really interesting there about the way senior leadership have delegated cultural ownership down to HR, which requires them to lead that double life of being both the police and a cultural enabler, and prevents them from having the right amount of distance, because they're having to like challenge friends and colleagues and people they're actually quite close to, because they're living in that delegated role of being the voice of culture. Whereas actually, I think what you've hit on there is the distance that senior executives are enjoying. Actually, you need to step down a level and really own that story and be the promoter and the celebrator and the advocate of culture, and really own that narrative. Be more on the front line with that story, so you can allow some space and some distance in the right way for your HR professionals. So you kind of need to kind of step down from the throne room a little bit, to have a better conversation, so you can own more of that narrative, right?
Yeah, yeah, and again, I probably humanize the players in this quite a lot. For me, we use this word culture, and I think very purposely. I don't know if it has been purposely, but what we haven't done is notice that this ethereal way that a lot of the big tools and metrics, etc., measure culture. It's all very conceptual. It's all very high level, And what we don't do is help leaders understand how this thing that's culture that we don't really know how to influence, and it's all smoke and mirrors, but we use words like authoritative and empowering, and we tell you the as is and the to be, but we don't tell you what's driving that and what you need to change around it. But you'll pay 500 grand to do that. It's ridiculous what happens around those things. One of the first things that I do in leadership engagement is literally sit down and say, people say, oh, define culture for me. And I go, we can do all the theoretical definitions, or what we do is say that culture is the systems, the habits, the processes, the beliefs that happen within your business that make people feel a certain type of way and give them a certain set of expectations about what will and won't get them out in trouble. And that's what drives their behavior. So as a leader, you might not think you're responsible for culture, but colleagues' behavior is either helping you to succeed in your strategic goals or it's biting you in the ass all day, every day. So if you don't think you own culture, then how are you ever going to influence behavior? And it's such a simple conversation to have. Go, okay,
Mm.
so if I make a decision in a slightly different way, or I look at my resourcing model in a slightly different way, or I do my business planning in a slightly different way, or I treat people individually, or how we show up as collectively, if we just do that slightly differently, we'll get this behavior instead. That is a whole different conversation to how do we become more empowering, or how do we become more enabling? The vocabulary that we've built around it creates smoke and mirrors, which I think scares leaders because they don't know what to do because it feels so complex. So that
Mm.
delegation for me isn't always about not wanting to do it. It's about the fact that we haven't created the vocabulary and the conversations to allow people to understand it. So one of the things that we created as a business was, as well as defining that as is and to be, to give people an anchor of what leadership tone you need to take, we built through thematic analysis of the things that we influence most within businesses, a culture driver map. So that sits underneath this kind of, where are we from a symptomatic point of view and where do we want to get to in terms of observed outcomes, to say, when we look at things like our systems and processes, our leadership behavior, our site contract, our colleagues' expectations about work and how our managers, etc., are behaving. So some of it's the behavioral stuff around leadership tone and management tone and colleague expectation, but also then looking at the infrastructure of the business to say, how are our rituals, our habits, our ingrained systems and processes pointing people towards certain types of behaviors? How are they serving us towards that ideal? And which ones do we need to start to re-engineer if we want to get different outcomes? And I find that is a huge activator for leaders, because suddenly what we're doing is dropping out a load of practical things that can happen, some of which is behavioral, but some of which actually is just helping them understand the consequences of their decisions. So if they, for example, are always accepting those board reports into exec that they don't think they should be making responsibility, or they shouldn't be making decisions for, but they just make the decision anyway, helping them recognize that that's accidentally reinforcing unhelpful behaviors around learned helplessness, and therefore just saying, okay, so let's create a new filter in terms of what you put back and explaining why. Suddenly you're giving people much more tangible actions that fit into their day-to-day rituals and habits. So for me, we've got to give leaders a chance to understand practically how they can shift things, rather than just doing all the, let's look at the personality profile, let's look at your natural style and ask them to be something else, because that feels huge and overwhelming. We focus more on some practical shifts that show them the moves, and then start to focus more on those broader personal preferences and behaviors a bit further down the line, really.
I think this is so rich and so valuable. If you're a leader and you're kind of tuning in to what Paul and I are talking about, the kind of humanization, the kind of the stepping away from abstract concepts that are hard to kind of wrap your head around, right? Thinking and using common sense language to begin challenging yourself around culture and how to shape it. These are the things that are going to unlock ownership, innovation, creativity. Like, these are not soft skills. These are, they are in one sense soft skills, but they are also deeply powerful commercial drivers. This is the kind of stuff that when you don't have it, deeply affects your bottom line. And when you do have it, you achieve financial velocity, you achieve you build better products, you run better marketing campaigns. Like, it all starts with culture. One thing I always say is that culture is the only differentiator that matters. So I really want people who are listening and watching this to really pay attention to some of the stuff, or just skip back a couple of minutes and just listen to what Paul is saying, because this is the kind of stuff that's going to unlock organizational resilience, speed, growth. It's going to impact the bottom line. This is gold. And one of the ways that I mean, I totally agree with you. Obviously, I'm getting passionate and sort of
Convert.
yeah, joining the chorus here. But it's the reason why we talk about intention, action, and outcome, because we want to create a really simple lens with which you can assess the things that you're doing. Like, what's the intention here? Because it might be that, we want to figure out how to be more collaborative, but that question by itself is too abstract. You've got to think through, okay, so if that's our intention, what we want to achieve, the second question is, okay, so what are some of the things that we can actually do? What's the action part of that? And then, of course, at the end of that process is those outcomes. And again, I just want to sort of echo something I said before, because when you don't have all of those things in place, or you're not following a process like the one Paul has described, you haven't got culture. Like, you can define it however you want, but you haven't got culture. You've got propaganda. And that's what I want leaders to really tune into today and say, like, if it feels like your culture isn't working, there's probably something broken in that chain of events. And actually, your organization is saying stuff that people don't experience when they're at work and in their day to day. And if they don't experience what you're saying to be true, that's when they disengage. It's where they lose their ownership. They lose their sense of security. They lose their sense of passion about what they're a part of, because what the organization says is not what they experience. And so you've got to start addressing some of those things. And what Paul has been saying to you, honestly, it's gold. So like I said, skip back a couple of minutes and just listen to this whole section again. Now, we are well over halfway through our episode and we haven't talked about most of the things that we were saying we were going to talk about, which I often think is a very good sign of a good episode. But I know you've been thinking through your culture crush and a leadership challenge and what people can do about it. I think we've talked probably at length about some of these things already, but
Yeah.
let's segue for a second and talk about your culture crush. Who are they? Could be a person or organization, but who are they and why have you chosen them?
Yeah, so my current culture crush, I'm a bit obsessed with him really, is Danny Wareham. I don't know if you've come across him, but he's done some amazing research recently. He's an organizational psychologist who recently did some research around the concept of leadership and really kind of well, his research, I was going to say he proved, that's a very emphatic position. His study certainly supported the idea that leadership isn't just about an individual, but actually a lot around the environmental cues and kind of the habits and rituals that we build into environments really give people some of those leadership cues and direction on things. So really interesting the kind of curiosity that he's put into that research and what he's found. He's built a model called Constellation Leadership, which is pretty cool. So if you want to check out something that's thinking about some of these elements that I was talking about around how do we re-engineer the environment to get what we want from in terms of outcomes around behavior, rather than trying to force it all through our own individual behaviors and just trying to mold ourselves into the perfect leadership model. He's definitely someone I'd encourage you to check out.
Awesome. I'll definitely be having a look at Daniel Wareham, you said. And one thing I've just noted here before we move on to leadership challenges, the material you were talking about before, your process, that kind of underlying document, that cultural drivers map that you were talking about before. Is that something that we can share in the show notes with people?
Yeah, absolutely. We open source all of our methodology. So we've got a webinar link on it, but also resources on our website. So I'll give you the links to those. Absolutely.
Awesome. I just thought that was worth I'd made a note and
Yeah.
I thought before we move on, I must try and remember that. But Danny, I want to talk to you directly for a moment because you've been name dropped on Culture Crush, and this is yet to happen. Like, so far, when somebody's been named as a Culture Crush on the show, I say this every time and it's yet to happen. It would be great to welcome you to an episode of the show. And I'm sure Paula would love to come back and join me, and we can have a conversation together about Constellation Leadership or another leadership challenge that you want to talk about on the show. But it'd be great to have you on. So I'd love it, Danny, if you would be the first person to answer this call. I'm not sure how you would see this episode, but hopefully you can be the first culture cross to actually say hello back. That'd be lovely. We'll
Maybe I
see.
can be a culture matchmaker. You never know. We'll connect.
Yeah, well, we're always looking for the next go-to-market strategy, right? That might be a good one. Now, the final stop on our journey together. I know you've been thinking about leadership challenges and what people can do about them. We love to be really practical on the show. And I'm sure that the big theme here has already been kind of like rolled into some of the things that we've already been talking about. But when you've been thinking specifically about a leadership challenge, what has that been? And why don't you take the solution with that as well? What can leaders do to get really practical around that issue?
One of the things that I really notice, I think, I'll talk about a specific kind of leadership challenge within a particular kind of cultural paradigm that we kind of deal with, which is that piece around how do we get people to take more accountability, which on the flip side is the question of how do we support leaders to take a more empowering and enabling approach. And I think spent a lot of my career in rooms with leaders, looking at preferences, talking about dynamics, etc. And I think what I've realized through those years is that actually where a leadership team has had a high degree of control in their approach, often there's a reason for that. There's been some sort of crisis, issue, high period of growth where there hasn't been talent below them that's allowed them to lead through. So the first thing I would say in terms of supporting on that is humanizing and understanding the origin story and recognizing that it might just not be that everybody's a control freak, but something has made that behavior functional at some point in time. But one of the other things that I notice is when there has been that sense of high control and centralized ownership of decisions within leadership teams, is that people get really used to becomes an accidental suppression of talent. So the people below them get used to not making decisions or don't have the experience to make decisions around things. So when you set the intention of being more empowering, often you don't have the infrastructure and the support and the capability that you need below you. So generally what I encourage is if you as a leader have the intention of trying to foster personal responsibility within your teams, it's best not to just jump straight to accountability and try and manage people through that. Really, the most helpful thing to do is have a look at what is it that you want to let go? What capability do you have within your team to drive that? And build a 3 to 6 month plan for the transition. So have some contracting conversations about what you want people to own moving forward and what that looks like, but also talk to them about what support, what mentoring, what additional development you're going to give them to help them take that journey. And in doing that, you're making it far more likely that it's going to succeed because you've set a clear set of contracting and expectation. You're supporting people to get the accountability, get the capability around that. So you're creating the basis of accountability that's much more robust in the longer term. But the other thing that you're doing is managing your own fear and uncertainty about that transition, making it much less likely that you're going to default back to doing what you've always done because it's quicker and easier and you've got a really big and busy job. So for me, every change should be about a transition. It should be about a journey. And how do we work together to shift the responsibilities that we're working with? How do we make sure that we're building that capability in the other people and the confidence to do that stuff, but also building the confidence and comfort in ourselves to let go? And that's how we drive sustainable change and something that will actually work. So small steps that drive so I talk often about standards, capability and accountability. So make sure you're clear on the standard, you support people to have the capability to do what's required. And at that point, then start to deliver around the accountability side. And you'll be much more likely to create something that really drives some change.
What I love about this approach, I know that I've been sort of banging on about this a bit today, so forgive me, but I keep talking about intention, action and outcome. But what I think is really interesting, literally as you were speaking through it, I could see how those different stages fall into place. So intention is around the standards or the ownership. That's kind of like what we want to do. That's the thing we want to champion. That's our intention. Then the infrastructure piece, that's around the action. That's about the how do we do this? Like, how do we do this meaningfully? Because as you said, I think lots of people jump to the outcome straight away, which in this case is accountability. But
Mhm.
as you say, so many businesses, we know the result that we want. And so we try to skip to the end. We try and go, well, let's just go to that thing straight away. But oftentimes it's too abstract, or we don't have the right infrastructure in place to do that, as you say. So that standard, that ownership piece is the intention. The action is around the infrastructure, like the how are we going to move towards that goal? And the accountability piece, the result that you want to get, that actually is an outcome. That doesn't need to happen for a bit. You can focus on your process for a little while. But I think that's so interesting, again, to see the kind of the mirror between your approach as the employee experience project and the sort of the language that I'm using here over at Anthem. I think
Absolutely.
that's so powerful. And so what you've just talked us through just really resonates powerfully with me. And I would encourage leaders to really apply the process, apply the thinking that Paul has just talked us through to think through how you're going to address these leadership challenges. Now, as I said, we love to come into land with something super practical, and everything we talked about already, right, is really practical. You and I
It's high
are
roll.
inviting leaders, right? We're inviting leaders to enter the world of common sense language, right? Come with us. Come and use some real world speak to
Yeah.
deal with real world challenges. Um, but we love to finish the show with one thing that people can take away and try, or one place to focus first. So thinking around this challenge and this solution, what's the one thing that you want our listeners and viewers to take away and try, or take away and think about as soon as the episode finishes?
For me, it's about if you're in a culture change journey at the moment, it's about having the conversation about what's the first step, what is reasonable for us to expect moving forward. So I think and that might be very different for different groups. For HR people leaders, for me, that first step is about how do we shift from this role of superhero into being much more of an enabler and a conductor of culture. For leaders, it might be about looking at the behavioral priority that they're trying to influence and thinking, not how do we get to the end of that, but actually what would make me feel like we're starting the journey. So often I think we rush to the end point and get frustrated because we don't get there within 2 days or 3 weeks. So I think if you're caught in a culture quandary, or you're caught in that swirl of not being sure if things are working or not, take a minute, see where you are, and ask yourself the question as an individual or as a project group of what does the next step look like? What does one step of momentum look like? And focus your effort and energy towards that. So I think small, sustainable steps that are concentrated on tangible outcomes will get you much more progress than doing big tick list things that feel like a fanfare, but perhaps just fade away because they're not connected to something that feels attainable to others.
Small, sustainable steps. That is such a great place for us to come into land. And Paula, it's been such a rich and enjoyable conversation. So I want to say a massive thank you for making a hole in your diary for Culture Crush. It's been great to see you again. And let's make sure that we speak again soon. And that's a wrap for today's episode of Culture Crush. If you've enjoyed your time with us, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening from. And if you're a culture first leader, be sure to visit anthem.oo because we've got lots in common. See you next time.